Good morning, everybody. General Officer, Commanding ladies, gentlemen, you're very welcome to the second day of our two-day history conference, a collaboration between the Military Archives and the Military History Society of Ireland. The first section we have today is going to focus on some of the technical aspects of the Civil War. It's going to be really interesting. It's going to cover the birth of the Air Corps, the 18-pounder field gun and armour in the Civil War. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Pat McCarthy. Pat is a native of Waterford, though he'd never mention it. A long-time member of the Military History Society of Ireland. He holds a PhD and an MBA from UCD and has worked for many years in the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector. He's the author of The Irish Revolution, 1912 to 23, Waterford and the 1916 Rising, The Redmonds and Waterford, A Political Dynasty, 1891 to 1952, and has published extensively in the Irish Sword and in other journals. Would you please welcome Dr. Pat McCarthy.
Good morning. Now, the Irish calendar tends to be fairly predictable. Things happen every year at certain times. And September has always been the month when results are published for exams, which attract wide publicity, etc. And it was the same in 1916. And in 1916, on September the 23rd, yesterday would have been a very appropriate day to do it, the results for that year are published, the secondary school results, and these got wide publicity. The local newspaper in Waterford, the Munster Express, highlighted for Waterpark College. It said, the intermediate prize list just published shows that Waterpark College continues to hold its high position among the schools and colleges of Ireland. And it published photographs of some of the prize winners. The gentleman on the left, or the schoolboy on the bottom left there, William McSweeney, aged 17, got 4th place in Ireland in chemistry, for which he was awarded a prize of £2, which, by the way, was the equivalent of a week's wages for a qualified operative in manufacturing. So he got the prize of £2, September 1916. Less than 6 years later, he's there on the left. He has the rank of Commandant, later Major General, and he's GOC of the fledgling, what they called the Irish Free State Military Air Service, or the Air Corps. So that immediately poses two questions. How did he get there at that age? And how did he perform in building up the Air Corps? Not just the challenge of building up the Air Corps, of establishing it, but doing so with a war raging around them and with Michael Collins demanding action this day. Now, the first question is relatively easily answered. Having finished his schooling in 1916, his father died early the following year, and he applied for a cadetship in the Royal Flying Corps, as it was then. His application form had a line, sports, and he certainly filled them in the right order. Rugby, cricket, rowing, and left to last was hurling. But as I say, he filled them in the right order. Early in 1918, he was commissioned into what was now the Royal Air Force and served with number 50 Squadron. Now, number 50 Squadron was a home defence squadron. In 1918, the Germans had started using Gotha biplanes, big biplanes, to bomb London from bases in Belgium. There was no early warning system, so the RAF used a lot of standing patrols. Aircraft on fine days will be sent up just to be in the air over Kent, which meant for McSweeney and other pilots a lot of flying, no combat. He didn't see any combat. In July 1919, he was declared surplus to requirements and, like tens of thousands of others, was demobilised. Came back to Dublin and enrolled as a science student in the College of Science. And he was there studying away until in 1921 he was approached by Emmett Dalton. Dalton and Collins were formulating the plan to rescue Sean McCone from Mountjoy Jail. And a key element in that plan was capturing a peerless armoured car which made a regular run to the abattoir to get meat for the Dublin garrison, and to use that to spring McCone from Mountjoy. The Peerless was armed with 2 Hotchkiss machine guns, and that presented a slight problem. The Hotchkiss had not been used by the British Army during the First World War, so ex-British Army men who had joined the IRA, such as Emmett Dalton, did not have any experience with the Hotchkiss, but it had been used by the RAF. And Emmett Dalton said he knew a man who could give them some idea about how the Hotchkiss operated. It had a reputation of being a temperamental weapon. And more importantly, this man was sound on the national question. That man was McSweeney. So McSweeney came along, briefed the volunteers on how the Hotchkiss would work and what to look out for. Now, as we know, the attempt came close to success, but was not. And that was McSweeney's contribution to the War of Independence. But as Sean Boyne outlined yesterday, Emmett Dalton, they were planning if the negotiations broke down, while the rest of the delegation would head for Hans Place and there to get a train. They didn't trust the British, so they had a plan for Michael Collins, which involved members of the squad being in London. Collins would get into a car with them, and they would head out to Croydon to the airport to be flown back to Ireland. Charlie Russell, another ex-RAF pilot who was in the IRA, and McSweeney were entrusted with that plan. Their first job was to purchase an aircraft. They looked at a lot of aircraft and decided on the Martin side a biplane there. One of the things that they were conscious of was cost, and the other thing, they wanted the aircraft to be readily adapted so that it could be used primitive bomb racks. Now, having purchased the aircraft, McSweeney returned to Ireland and looked after the preparations for the reception. If it was going to be used, the aircraft would fly west, following the Great Western Railway, go as far as Fishguard, cross the Irish Sea, then follow the track of the Dublin South Eastern Railway, land at Leopardstown, where Collins would disembark, and McSweeney, as part of it, would have petrol there to refuel it, and then it would fly to somewhere in the Midlands, I've never found out where it would be hidden. And if fighting resumed, they hoped to use it on a once-off mission to drop bombs on Dublin Castle and on Beggar's Bush, then land the aircraft on Sandymount Strand and leave it. That obviously never came to pass. But Collins, who had a very real interest in aviation, in March 1922, he appointed McSweeney Director of Military Aviation with the rank of Major General, and Russell was appointed of Director of Civil Aviation. Collins already at that stage was thinking in terms of an air service between Dublin and London. Hence, Russell, Director of Civil Aviation. So that's how he got there. It did not win universal approval. Captain Dunphy on the IRA GHQ staff said, "You may as well appoint a trainee engine driver to run the Great Southern and Western Railway," which was hardly a vote of confidence in McSweeney. So McSweeney took up his position, initially with an office in Beggar's Bush, then for a very brief time with an office here in Portobello, before finally moving to Baldonnel. And he was there when the Civil War started. Now, he had drawn up a number of plans to develop the Air Force, but these had all been shot down by the Department of Finance in the new provisional government on the grounds of cost. So when the Civil War started, his command consisted of 7 personnel, or more accurately, 6.5. One of them was a Miss Kiernan, a part-time typist. He had 1 aircraft, the one the Martin side, which was in crates on the tarmac in Baldonnel, waiting to be assembled. And the Civil War had started, and Collins was demanding action. Now, that was Baldonnel when it was being built. He inherited Baldonnel, and it was intact, physically intact. There had been no damage done to it, but it had been stripped of anything useful in terms of equipment for maintenance or for the support of the aircraft. So, what are his challenges? First of all, recruitment of personnel. Then, getting aircraft. Operations. What were the planes going to be used for during the Civil War? And also, building up an infrastructure. So let's take those in turn. The RAF were keeping a close eye on all of what was going on in Ireland at this time. And the Air Staff Intelligence Unit summarised the position in quite a long memo in August 1922. I'll read 2 bits. So far, 2 officers have been prominent in the collection of machines for the Free State Air Force. One of these is a Mr. Russell, and the other is known as Commandant McSweeney. Both are relatively young and are ex-RAF. Mr. Russell has been employed since the war end as a grocer's assistant, and until a few weeks ago. Neither of these officers appear to be of a high grade of intelligence. So much for coming fourth in Ireland in chemistry. It goes on further. The future of the Free State Air Force will depend on their ability to procure trained pilots and mechanics. It is understood there are a large number of ex-RAF, other ranks, resident in Ireland, who might be willing to serve if the terms offered were satisfactory. There are a large number of ex-RAF pilots, but it is doubtful whether the better class of Irish ex-RAF officers will be disposed to serve in the Free State Air Force in view of the admittedly very low social standing of the majority of the officers in the Free State forces. I hasten to add, that's the RAF view, it's not mine. Now, interesting there, the pool of mechanics and ground personnel. In parallel with the conscription crisis, the British Army, the War Office, had launched a major recruiting drive in Ireland in 1918. And it was relatively successful. Nothing near the 50,000 a month that they wanted, but a significant number joined up. And they were, as part of this recruiting drive, they were offered, you can pick whatever regiment or corps or arm of the service you want. And thousands of them literally joined the RAF. So there was a good pool of mechanics, fitters, ground staff. Pilots, despite the reservations, there was a degree of success. In June, the two pilots in the Air Corps were McSweeney and Russell. As soon as the war started, Russell transferred to the Air Corps as second in command. Freddie Crossley joined in July. In August, T.J. Maloney. In September, you had a half dozen of them joining up, including two notable people, John Arnott and James Fitzmaurice. Arnott, we don't know how he got into the Air Corps, but he must have impressed McSweeney, because McSweeney appointed him when Russell left the Air Corps to take charge of the Railway Maintenance Corps. Arnott was appointed second in command in charge of flying operations. But it was found out shortly afterwards that Arnott's military career had included a session in the auxiliaries in Dublin. And he had stayed in Ireland when they were disbanded because he had married a lady from Dublin. When they found out that he was an ex-auxiliary, he was dismissed. Legend in Baldonnel always has it that he was escorted to the mailboat by two armed men, put on the mailboat and told, if you ever come back to Ireland, you'll be shot. So that was his brief career. Fitzmaurice, of course, much different. But from the beginning, Fitzmaurice did not apparently get on too well with McSweeney. There's Fitzmaurice. And that was his view of McSweeney. The officer commanding McSweeney was an ex of the Royal Air Force whose flying experience was practically nil. This youth held the exalted rank of Major General and was always accompanied by an equally youthful aide-de-camp who was festooned with lethal weapons, presenting a picture that resembles something out of a comic strip. An air of hedonism prevailed at the aerodrome, where the most amazing characters kept popping in and settling down, so that they had nothing. They had ranks which appeared to have been conferred on themselves, and they were almost completely illiterate. Now, as I say, Fitzmaurice, he wrote that subsequently, and there's an air of retrospective bias in it. But you can understand that they did not get on too well together. So at least he's building up competent pilots and a supporting air structure. And that was Arnott. He resigned, escorted to the mailboat at gunpoint. Some of the ground crew, from the beginning, they had no problem getting competent ground crew, all of whom had been trained by the RAF. On Churchill's instructions, there was a residual detachment of the Royal Air Force based in Collinstown, part of No. 2 Squadron. They were told, when the opening shots were fired, to make all assistance to this new military air service, as they called it. So on the July the 5th, they handed over the first of two Bristol fighters. Charlie Russell took delivery of it. and according to legend, he flew from Collinstown to Baldonnel while wearing a bowler hat because he couldn't find a helmet. But both that one, the first and the third Bristol fighters, gave problems with serviceability, and we'll come to that now in a moment. So McSweeney quickly formed the opinion that the Bonham Carter, the OC in Collinstown, was using the opportunity to get rid of his least serviceable aircraft. And McSweeney insisted thereafter of purchasing new aircraft from the Air Disposal Company in the UK. Now, as I say, Collins had a huge interest, and there are minutes of meetings, and it was more or less at all time Collins demanding action this day. For example, on July the 28th, there was a meeting, and that was a Friday. It lasted well into the afternoon, and at the end of it, Collins instructed McSweeney to go across to England to buy two SE-5As, a standard fighter aircraft. And he said, I want them in Baldonnel not later than Monday afternoon. Now, buying an aircraft from the Air Disposal Company involved refitting armament, giving it a good mechanical checkup and so on like that. So that was an unrealistic timetable. But it shows Collins, in a sense, micromanaging. He has picked the aircraft that he wants, and he's demanding action, action, action. But throughout July, August, and right up to the end of the year, there was aircraft being purchased, and most of them were collected by McSweeney himself. And McSweeney was careful. The price of each aircraft being purchased included a 1-hour refresher lesson, because McSweeney hadn't flown an aircraft since 1919, and other of these pilots were much the same. You can see he purchased one SE-5A, but showing that he was independent of Collins, the same purchase order, he went for a Martinsyde F4, which was the most modern fighter aircraft then entering service in with the RAF. And he standardised on Bristol fighters, Martinsyde F4s as fighters, later DH9s as bombers, which is the standard bombing aircraft in the Royal Air Force. And he also started a training school for Avro 504s. So he has addressed the issue of aircraft, of personnel. There's a Bristol fighter, an Avro trainer, the Martinsyde F4, and the DH9 bomber aircraft, all Air Corps aircraft. Now, operations. As soon as the anti-treaty forces retreated from Dublin and gathered at Blessington in early July, Collins is demanding air reconnaissance over Wicklow. And on July the 16th, we get the first recorded mission, flown by McSweeney himself. And he flies over the Wicklow. He records irregulars, as they were being called by that stage, gathering at Tullow. And he notices and he records they're standing around the village. They're not doing anything. They're not preparing barricades. They show no inclination to fight. And he reports the same for all the villages and towns in East Wicklow, Ballymore, etc. On his way back, he has a problem with the aircraft. The engine cuts out and it crash lands near Naas. His observer is badly injured, Lieutenant Nolan, and McSweeney is lucky. And again, That was one of the two ex-RAF aircraft, and McSweeney was convinced there was a mechanical problem with the fuel pump, and he was proved correct. So that is why he stopped this whole idea of taking aircraft from the RAF directly. And that was the aircraft. Now, after Wicklow, and there was quite intensive flying over Wicklow in July, the focus moved south. And the so-called Munster Republic, with the Limerick to Waterford line, was to be defended. Again, Collins is demanding air reconnaissance. And the first thing McSweeney does is he looks for suitable airfields. Baldonnel is too far away. So he goes down, he finds a suitable airfield near Kilkenny, and when Waterford is captured, he takes over, not the Tramore racecourse as some people think, but there was at that time a Waterford racecourse, just on the outskirts of the city. He takes that over, and from there, he's able to use flights to do reconnaissance over Cork, over West Waterford and Cork. He does the same in Limerick, takes over the racecourse, and from there, reconnaissance over Kilmallock, etc. On August the 9th, there's a reconnaissance in support of the landing in Cork. Russell is flying. The aircraft is fired upon near Middleton from the ground by anti-treaty forces on its return. And immediately, Russell turns the aircraft and strafes the irregulars. Doesn't hit anybody. But the RAF had spent 2 years in Ireland flying aircraft and had spent 2 years agonising on whether they would arm the aircraft or not. Straight away, the Irish Air Corps responded differently. You fired at them, they fired back at you. On the 22nd of August, there's a message, goes to Army HQ. Tell Russell that Fermoy is suitable for landing. Ask him if he will fly over Macroom to Ballyvourney, Bandon to Dunmanway. These places must be reconnoitred. And that's from Michael Collins, the day of Bail na Blow. It shows you again Collins's conviction and interest in military aviation. And it also shows that Fermoy would become the main operational base. Now, it was October, beginning of October, by the time that they actually occupied and brought Fermoy into use. Fermoy, there's Fermoy Aerodrome to the north, the two big barracks in Fermoy there. The hangars shown there when they were rebuilt. But the reason for the slowness of it being taken over was, according to Fitzmaurice, the aerodrome presented the appearance of having suffered an attack by locusts, possessing a voracious appetite for galvanized iron sheets, wood, glass, and everything that went up to make the aerodrome buildings. We discovered that the various buildings and the equipment had been dismantled and sold by auction, and the material scattered about in the numerous farmsteads for miles around. Literally, I'll go back now. They had to rebuild. They could not have the aircraft simply stationed in the open as winter came in. So they spent weeks scouring every farmyard, every farm in North Cork, retrieving the galvanised, which had been looted. I don't believe it was auctioned off, it was simply looted on that. In the meantime, McSweeney purchased tarpaulins to protect the aircraft. Now, he also appointed Fitzmaurice in charge, and that was a good move from his point of view. He was appointing a very capable officer to take charge of the operational side, and since he wasn't in Baldonnel, the friction between the two of them was no longer an issue, or at least for the moment. The focus, he had 4 aircraft in Fermoy, plus 1 in Kerry. They took over a field that the RAF had used near Ballymullen Barracks, and Walter Delamere, one of the pilots, was stationed there with 1 aircraft. Reconnaissances. Now the SE-5A was lost when it first landed near Mallow and was burned by the irregulars while the pilot went for assistance. Now we get some idea of, by reports, Delamere in Tralee. There's a typical report for January. Army aeroplane flying over Brennan's Glen, which is just north of Killarney, fired on by a party of 30 irregulars. 1 bomb dropped and machine gun fire opened from aeroplane. Simultaneously, Dublin Guards arrived from Killarney and attempted encircling movement. Irregulars retreated, and in running fight, irregulars suffered 6 casualties. On average, Delamere flew about 10 missions a month. He was the only pilot there in Kerry. Fitzmaurice described operations from Fermoy. Our duties consisted of providing air escorts to military convoys moving through difficult mountain countryside. These convoys were engaged in cleaning up operations which called for a garrison in every town and village. They were subject to ambush only in difficult country, where the terrain was suitable to the irregulars, that is to stray stretches of country allowing them a safe, commanding fire position. Our arrival over such scenes brought an abrupt end to these capers. End of quote. So they are serving a useful function, apart from, if you like, the psychological effect of these aircraft armed, ready to use their armament, flying high in the sky. There were problems with weather and with serviceability, but these were the exact same problems that the RAF had had 2 years previously. As I said, that's Fermoy. Now, if you look at that particular one, you see the frame of a hangar. They hadn't recovered all the galvanised on that. You see it there again, up near the top left-hand corner, the steel frame of the hangar, but still waiting its galvanised to be recovered. And there's a photograph of the 3 types of aircraft in Fermoy. The Martin side, a Bristol fighter, and 2 DH-9s, with preparing for a mission. Now, the Stump Arms Order, the ceasefire, did not bring an end to all this operational flying, because the pursuit of irregulars who were on the run continued. So they continued to fly operational patrols out of Fermoy throughout May, June, July. Oh, sorry. Meanwhile, McSweeney is back at base. He's having ongoing, I'm only going to use the word battles, but it's not quite appropriate in the context of a war. He's having ongoing conflict with superior officers and with the department. He put in a requisition for 2 wireless sets when Fermoy opened up. One for Fermoy, one for Baldonnel, saying that the telephones were completely unreliable and were usually cut. There's a long discussion with the department about the need for these. In the end, the department offered to sanction the purchase of one. But there was method in their madness. What they said was, it's not a case of expecting the single wireless set to talk to itself. What it said was, you can use it to communicate with headquarters in Portobello, and they'll deliver any messages they deem important to Baldonnel. So again, it's this idea of control. They were afraid, some people were afraid, that McSweeney was setting up almost an independent command. He had the same thing with the purchase of these small 9-pound bombs that were ideal for anti-personnel use. He put in a requisition to buy literally a couple of thousand of these. Discussions continued until March of 1923. 5 months of discussion. The war was practically over by then. He got permission to purchase a couple of hundred. But he had one problem. By November 1922, there was over 400 personnel in Baldonnel. Over half them were what was called the Air Service Infantry. And it was unclear whether these were supposed to report to McSweeney or to report to the Dublin Command. The infantry officers preferred to report to the Dublin Command, and did so, even though McSweeney repeatedly told them, you report to me, I'm in command here. But there was a bigger problem than that. Some of them had sympathies with the Republican side, and they had made contact with Paddy Mullaney, who was commanding a very active anti-treaty flying column around Leixlip. Mullaney came, inspected, examined the base, visited it a couple of times, and formulated a plan to capture Baldonnel, using the 20 men of his flying column, plus about 80 men from the Dublin Brigade, commanded by Todd Andrews. On the night in question, Mullaney, with some of his men, occupied the guardhouse in Baldonnel with the assistance of sympathisers. But the Dublin Brigade men never showed up. And it is said that apart from capturing Baldonnel and hundreds of rifles and machine guns, that they had a plan to use 2 of the aircraft to bomb Leinster House and Portobello and Beggar's Bush. And they had identified 2 ex-RAF pilots who could fly the aircraft, one of whom they identified as Erskine Childers, who had made his way back to Dublin at this stage. That plan fell through. It never happened. But 6 of the sympathisers deserted. And they deserted on the 28th of November. But on the 1st of December, all of Mullaney's column was captured in a fight near Pike's Bridge. The 5, one of them was not recognised. 5 of them, of these deserters, were court-martialed and sentenced to death. And on the 8th of January 1923, they were executed by firing squad. It's not clear. There are various references. Some people say the executions took place in Richmond Barracks. One source says Kilmainham, and a number of sources say that they were executed here in Portobello. I'd say more likely to be Kilmainham, but we don't know. It could have been here. As I said, flying continued. And on the 25th of June, a DH-9 took off from Fermoy on a mission, reconnaissance mission, and a few hundred yards north of the airport, it crashed. And there you see the crash scene. The pilot survived. He's there on the ground with the priest standing over him and so on. And the observer was killed. So that, if we like, brought peace and the problems of peace. I would suggest that the Air Corps, given its, if you like, given the lack of definition of the role of aircraft in counterinsurgency, that it made a small but useful contribution to the National Army and to the success of the government forces. And in terms of building up an infrastructure, Max Sweeney didn't do too bad. The Air Corps is lucky. Colonel Michael O'Malley produced that book about 10 years ago. And it's a superb history, both of this period and later periods. But I'm sure the final question, whatever happened to Max Sweeney? I always think if you're a Major General and commanding a corps at the age of 23, there's only one way you can go, and he went. He was implicated in the mutiny. He was forced to resign solely on the testimony of Fitzmaurice. Now, having read some of it, I don't believe that he was actively involved, but he was forced to resign and he was the highest ranking officer to suffer or to be penalised because of alleged involvement in the mutiny. So that's the brief career of Joe McSweeney. Sorry, not Joe McSweeney, Jasper McSweeney, William Jasper McSweeney, or Jack as he was often called, and the Air Corps during the Civil War. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Pat.